The Trial for Murder by Charles Dickens. I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychological experiences when those have been of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that what they could relate in such wise would find no parallel or response in a listener's internal life, and might be suspected or laughed at. A truthful traveller, who should have seen some extraordinary creature in the likeness of a sea serpent, would have no fear of mentioning it, but the same traveller, having had some singular presentiment, impulse, vagary of thought, visions so called, dream, or other remarkable mental impression, would hesitate considerably before he would own to it. To this reticence I attribute much of the obscurity in which such subjects are involved. We do not habitually communicate our experiences of these subjective things as we do our experiences of objective creation. The consequence is, that the general stock of experience in this regard appears exceptional, and really is so, in respect of being miserably imperfect. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever. I know the history of the bookseller of Berlin. I have studied the case of the wife of a late Astronomer Royal, as related by Sir David Brewster, and I have followed the minutest details of a much more remarkable case of spectral illusion occurring within my private circle of friends. It may be necessary to state as to this last, that the sufferer, a lady, was in no degree, however distant, related to me. A mistaken assumption on that head might suggest an explanation of a part of my own case, but only a part, which would be wholly without foundation. I cannot be referred to my inheritance of any developed peculiarity, nor had I ever before any at all similar experience, nor have I ever had any at all similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body was buried in Newgate Jail. I purposely abstain from giving any direct clue to the criminal's individuality. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell, or I ought to say, for I cannot be too precise in my facts, it was nowhere publicly hinted that any suspicion fell on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was at that time made to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him can at that time have been given in the newspapers. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. I read it twice, if not 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper I was aware of a flash, rush, flow, I do not know what to call it. No word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room, like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in chambers in Piccadilly, very near the corner of St. James Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy chair at the moment, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position, but it is to be noted that the chair ran easily on casters. I went to one of the windows (there are 2 in the room, and the room is on the 2nd floor) to refresh my eyes with the moving objects down in Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the street was sparkling and cheerful. The wind was high. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw 2 men on the opposite side of the way going from west to east. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the singularity and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a thoroughfare attracted my attention, and next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. Both men threaded their way among the other passengers with a smoothness hardly consistent even with the action of walking on a pavement, and no single creature, that I could see, gave them place, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my window, they both stared up at me. I saw their two faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was of the color of impure wax. I am a bachelor, and my valet and his wife constitute my whole establishment. My occupation is in a certain branch bank, and I wish that my duties as head of a department were as light as they are popularly supposed to be. They kept me in town that autumn when I stood in need of change. I was not ill, but I was not well. My reader is to make the most that can be reasonably made of my feeling jaded, having a depressing sense upon me of a monotonous life, and being slightly dyspeptic. I am assured by my renowned doctor that my real state of health at that time justifies no stronger description, and I quote his own from his written answer to my request for it. As the circumstances of the murder gradually unravelling took stronger and stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine by knowing as little about them as was possible in the midst of the universal excitement. But I knew that a verdict of wilful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed to Newgate for trial. I also knew that his trial had been postponed over one sessions of the Central Criminal Court, on the ground of general prejudice and want of time for the preparation of the defence. I may further have known, but I believe I did not, when, or about when, the sessions to which his trial stood postponed would come on. My sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room are all on one floor. With the last there is no communication but through the bedroom. True, there is a door in it, once communicating with the staircase, but a part of the fitting of my bath has been, and had been then for some years, fixed across it. At the same period, and as a part of the same arrangement, the door had been nailed up and canvassed over. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some directions to my servant before he went to bed. My face was towards the only available door of communication with the dressing room, and it was closed. My servant's back was towards that door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open and a man look in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. The man was the man who had gone second from the two along Piccadilly, and whose face was of the color of impure wax. The figure having beckoned drew back and closed the door. With no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom, I opened the dressing-room door and looked in. I had a lighted candle already in my hand. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing-room, and I did not see it there. Conscious that my servant stood amazed, I turned round to him and said, "Derrick, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancied I saw a—" As I there laid my hand upon his breast, with a sudden start he trembled violently and said, "O Lord, yes, sir, a dead man beckoning!" Now, I do not believe that this John Derrick, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen such a figure until I touched him. The change in him was so startling when I touched him, that I fully believe he derived his impression in some occult manner from me at that instant. I bade John Derrick bring me some brandy, and I gave him a dram, and was glad to take one myself. Of what had preceded the night's phenomenon I told him not a single word. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before, except on the one occasion in Piccadilly. Comparing its expression when beckoning at the door with its expression when it had stared up at me as I stood at my window, I came to the conclusion that on the first occasion it had sought to fasten itself upon my memory, and on the second occasion it had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, though I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. At daylight I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by John Derrick's coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. This paper, it appeared, had been the subject of an altercation at the door between its bearer and my servant. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never before been summoned on such a jury, as John Derrick well knew. He believed, I am not certain at this hour whether with reason or otherwise, that that class of jurors were customarily chosen on a lower qualification than mine, and he had at first refused to accept the summons. The man who served it had taken the matter very coolly. He said that my attendance or non-attendance was nothing to him. There the summons was, and I should deal with it at my own peril and not at his. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call or take no notice of it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attention one way or another. Of that I am as strictly sure as of every other statement that I make here. Ultimately I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. There was a dense brown fog in Piccadilly, and it became positively black, and in the last degree oppressive, east of Temple Bar. I found the passages and staircases of the court-house flaringly lighted with gas, and the court itself similarly illuminated. I think that until I was conducted by officers into the old court and saw its crowded state, I did not know that the murderer was to be tried that day. I think that until I was so helped into the old court with considerable difficulty, I did not know into which of the two courts sitting my summons would take me. But this must not be received as a positive assertion, for I am not completely satisfied in my mind on either point. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, and I looked about the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapor hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows, and I noticed the stifled sound of wheels on straw or tan that was littered in the street. Also the hum of the people gathered there, which a shrill whistle or a louder song or hail than the rest occasionally pierced. Soon afterwards the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared there, and in that same instant I recognized in him the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly. But it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say, "Here." Now observe, as I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking on attentively, but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated, and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney, with his hand upon the dock, whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards, challenge that man!" But that as he could give no reason for it, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called and I appeared, it was not done. Both on the ground already explained, that I wished to avoid reviving an unwholesome memory of that murderer, and also because a detailed account of his long trial is by no means indispensable to my narrative, I shall confine myself closely to such incidents in the 10 days and nights during which we, the jury, were kept together, as directly bear on my own curious personal experience. It is to that, and not to a page of the Newgate Calendar, that I beg attention. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours (I heard the church clock strike), happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them one too many. I touched the brother juryman whose place was next me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why," says he suddenly, "we are but no, that is not possible. No, we are 12." According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross we were always one too many. There was no appearance, no figure to account for it, but I had an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in one large room on separate tables, and we were constantly in the charge and under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safe keeping. I see no reason for suppressing the real name of that officer. He was intelligent, highly polite and obliging, and, I was glad to hear, much respected in the city. He had an agreeable presence, good eyes, enviable black whiskers, and a fine sonorous voice. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down, and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat beside him and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes, and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose and advanced a few steps, then stopped and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed, but I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It always went to the right-hand side of the bed, and always passed out crossing the foot of the next bed. It seemed, from the action of the head, merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me or of my bed, which was the nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning, at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man, so to speak, as if it had been borne into my comprehension by his immediate testimony. But even this took place, and in a manner for which I was not at all prepared. On the 5th day of the trial, when the case for the prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature of the murdered man, missing from his bedroom upon the discovery of the deed, and afterwards found in a hiding place where the murderer had been seen digging, was put in evidence. Having been identified by the witness under examination, it was handed up to the bench, and thence handed down to be inspected by the jury. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man, who had gone down Piccadilly, impetuously stared from the crowd, caught the miniature from the officer, and gave it to me in his own hands, at the same time saying in a low and hollow tone, before I saw the miniature, which was in a locket, "I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood." It also came between me and the brother juryman to whom I would have given the miniature, and between him and the brother juryman to whom he would have given it, and so it passed on through the whole of our number, and back into my possession. Not one of them, however, detected this. At table, and generally when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had from the first naturally discussed the day's proceedings a good deal. On that fifth day, the case for the prosecution being closed, and we having that side of the question in a completed shape before us, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our number was a vestryman, the densest idiot I've ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections, and who was sided with by two flabby parochial parasites, all three impanelled from a district so delivered over to fever that they ought to have been upon their own trial for 500 murders. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight, while some of us were already preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. This was the beginning of a separate series of appearances, confined to that long room in which we were confined. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, I saw the head of the murdered man among theirs. Whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly and irresistibly beckon to me. It will be borne in mind that down to the production of the miniature on the fifth day of the trial I had never seen the appearance in court. 3 changes occurred now as we entered on the case for the defense. 2 of them I will mention together first. The figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me, but always to the person who was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. In the opening speech for the defense it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment the figure, with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to (this it had concealed before), stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted by either hand. For another instance, a witness to character, a woman, deposed to the prisoner's being the most amiable of mankind. The figure at that instant stood on the floor before her, looking her full in the face and pointing out the prisoner's evil countenance with an extended arm and an outstretched finger. The third change now to be added impressed me strongly, as the most marked and striking of all. I do not theorize upon it. I accurately state it, and there leave it. Although the appearance was not itself perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to such persons was invariably attended by some trepidation or disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented by laws to which I was not amenable from fully revealing itself to others, and yet as if it could invisibly, dumbly, and darkly overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defense suggested that hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow frightfully sawing at its severed throat, it is undeniable that the counsel faltered in his speech, lost for a few seconds the thread of his ingenious discourse, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. When the witness to the character was confronted by the appearance, her eyes most certainly did follow the direction of its pointed finger, and rest with great hesitation and trouble upon the prisoner's face. 2 additional illustrations will suffice. On the 8th day of the trial, after the pause which was every day made early in the afternoon for a few minutes' rest and refreshment, I came back into court with the rest of the jury some little time before the return of the judges. Standing up in the box and looking about me, I thought the figure was not there, until, chancing to raise my eyes to the gallery, I saw it bending forward and leaning over a very decent woman, as if to assure itself whether the judges had resumed their seats or not. Immediately afterwards the woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. So with the venerable, sagacious, and patient judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over, and he settled himself and his papers to sum up, The murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered, "Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few minutes. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air," and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of 6 of those interminable 10 days, the same judges and others on the bench, the same murderer in the dock, the same lawyers at the table, the same tones of questions and answers rising to the roof of the court, the same scratching of the judge's pen, the same ushers going in and out, the same lights kindled at the same hour when there had been any natural light of day, the same foggy curtain outside the great windows when it was foggy, the same rain pattering and dripping when it was rainy, the same footmarks of turnkeys and prisoners day after day on the same sawdust, the same keys locking and unlocking the same heavy doors. Through all the wearisome monotony, which made me feel as if I had been foreman of the jury for a vast period of time, and Piccadilly had flourished coevally with Babylon, the murdered man never lost one trace of his distinctness in my eyes. Nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance, which I call by the name of the murdered man, look at the murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did. Nor did he look at me after the production of the miniature, until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. The idiomatic vestryman and his 2 parochial parasites gave us so much trouble that we twice returned into court to beg to have certain extracts from the judge's notes reread. 9 of us had not the smallest doubt about those passages. Neither, I believe, had any one in the court. The dunder-headed triumvirate, having no idea but obstruction, disputed them for that very reason. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned into court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box, on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me with great attention. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great grey veil, which he carried on his arm for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict, guilty, the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge, according to usage, whether he had anything to say before sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers the following day as a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words, in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial, because the foreman of the jury was prepossessed against him. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: "My lord, I knew I was a doomed man, when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because, before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope round my neck."
Uncle Abraham's Romance by E. Nesbit. "No, my dear," my Uncle Abraham answered me. "No, nothing romantic ever happened to me, unless— but no, that wasn't romantic either. I was. To me, I being 18, romance was the world. My Uncle Abraham was old and lame. I followed the gaze of his faded eyes, and my own rested on a miniature that hung at his elbow-chair's right hand, a portrait of a woman whose loveliness even the miniature painter's art had been powerless to disguise, a woman with large eyes that shone, and face of that alluring oval which one hardly sees nowadays. I rose to look at it. I had looked at it 100 times. Often enough in my baby days I had asked, "Who's that, uncle?" and always the answer was the same: A lady who died long ago, my dear. As I looked again at the picture, I asked, was she like this? Who? Your romance? Uncle Abraham looked hard at me. Yes, he said at last. Very, very like. I sat down on the floor by him. Won't you tell me about her? There's nothing to tell, he said. I think it was fancy mostly, and folly. But it's the realest thing in my life, my dear. A long pause. I kept silent. You should always give people time, especially old people. I remember, he said in the dreamy tone always promising so well to the ear that loves a story. I remember when I was a young man, I was very lonely indeed. I never had a sweetheart. I was always lame, my dear, from quite a boy, and the girls used to laugh at me. Silence again. Presently he went on. And so I got into the way of mooning off by myself in lonely places, and one of my favourite walks was up through our churchyard, which was set on a hill in the middle of the marsh country. I liked that, because I never met anyone there. It's all over, years ago. I was a silly lad, but I couldn't bear of a summer evening to hear a rustle and a whisper from the other side of the hedge, or maybe a kiss as I went by. Well, I used to go and sit all by myself in the churchyard, which was always sweet with the thyme, and quite light on account of its being so high, long after the marshes were dark. I used to watch the bats flitting about in the red light, and wonder why God didn't make everyone's legs straight and strong, and wicked follies like that. But by the time the light was gone, I had always worked it off, so to speak, and could go home quietly and say my prayers without bitterness. Well, one hot night in August, when I had watched the sunset fade and the crescent moon grow golden, I was just stepping over the low stone wall of the churchyard when I heard a rustle behind me. I turned around, expecting it to be a rabbit or a bird. It was a woman. He looked at the portrait. So did I. Yes, he said, that was her very face. I was a bit scared and said something, I don't know what. She laughed and said, did I think she was a ghost? And I answered back, and I stayed talking to her over the churchyard wall till it was quite dark, and the glowworms were out in the wet grass all along the way home. Next night I saw her again, and the next, and the next, always at twilight time, and if I passed any lovers leaning on the stiles in the marshes, it was nothing to me now. Again my uncle paused. It was very long ago, he said shyly, and I'm an old man, but I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was always lame, and the girls used to laugh at me. I don't know how long it went on. You don't measure time in dreams. But at last your grandfather said I looked as if I had one foot in the grave, and he would be sending me to stay with our kin in Bath, and to take the waters. I had to go. I could not tell my father why I would rather die than go. What was her name, uncle? I asked. She never would tell me her name, and why should she? I had names enough in my heart to call her by. Marriage? My dear, even then I knew marriage was not for me. But I met her, night after night, always in our churchyard, where the yew trees were, and the old crooked gravestones, so thick in the grass. It was there we always met, and always parted. The last time was the night before I went away. She was very sad, and dearer than life itself, and she said, if you come back before the new moon, I shall meet you here just as usual. But if the new moon shines on this grave, and you are not here, you will never see me again any more. She laid her hand on the tomb against which we had been leaning. It was an old, lichened, weather-worn stone, and its inscription was just Susanna Kingsnorth, Ob. 1723. I shall be here, I said. I mean it, she said, very seriously and slowly. It is no fancy. You'll be here when the new moon shines?" I promised, and after a while we parted. I had been with my kinsfolk in Bath for nearly a month. I was to go home on the next day, when, turning over a case in the parlour, I came upon that miniature. I could not speak for a minute. At last I said, with dry tongue and heart beating to the tune of heaven and hell, "Who is this?" "That?" said my aunt. "Oh, she was betrothed to one of our family years ago, but she died before the wedding. They say she was a bit of a witch. A handsome one, wasn't she?" I looked again at the face, the lips, the eyes of my dear lovely love, whom I was to meet to-morrow night when the new moon shone on that tomb in our churchyard. "Did you say she was dead?" I asked, and hardly knew my own voice. "Years and years ago. Her name's on the back, and the date." I took the portrait out of its case. I remember just the colour of its faded red velvet bed, and read on the back, "Susanna Kingsnorth, Ob. 1723. That was in 1823. My uncle stopped short. "What happened?" I asked breathlessly. "I believe I had a fit," my uncle answered slowly. "At any rate, I was very ill." "And you missed the new moon on the grave?" "I missed the new moon on the grave." "And you never saw her again?" "I never saw her again." "But, uncle, do you really believe? Can the dead... Was she? Did you?" My uncle took his pipe and filled it. "It's a long time ago," he said. "A many, many years. Old men's tales, my dear, old men's tales. Don't you take any notice of them." He lighted the pipe, and puffed silently a moment or two before he said, "But I know what youth means, and love and happiness, though I was always lame, and the girls used to laugh at me."
Man-Size in Marble by E. Nesbit. Although every word of this story is as true as despair, I do not expect people to believe it. Nowadays a rational explanation is required before belief is possible. Let me then at once offer the rational explanation which finds most favour among those who have heard the tale of my life's tragedy. It is held that we were under a delusion, Laura and I, on that 31st of October, and that this supposition places the whole matter on a satisfactory and believable basis. The reader can judge, when he too has heard my story, how far this is an explanation, and in what sense it is rational. There were three who took part in this, Laura and I and another man. The other man still lives, and can speak to the truth of the least credible part of my story. I never in my life knew what it was to have as much money as I required to supply the most ordinary needs, good colours, books, and cab fares. And when we were married, we knew quite well that we should only be able to live at all by strict punctuality and attention to business. I used to paint in those days, and Laura used to write, and we felt sure we could keep the pot at least simmering. Living in town was out of the question, so we went to look for a cottage in the country, which should be at once sanitary and picturesque. So rarely do these two qualities meet in one cottage that our search was, for some time, quite fruitless. We tried advertisements, but most of the desirable rural residences which we did look at proved to be lacking in both essentials, and when a cottage chanced to have drains, it always had stucco as well, and was shaped like a tea-caddy. And if we found a vine or rose-covered porch, corruption invariably lurked within. Our minds got so befogged by the eloquence of house-agents, and the rival disadvantages of the fever-traps and outrages to beauty which we had seen and scorned, that I very much doubt whether either of us on our wedding morning knew the difference between a house and a haystack. But when we got away from friends and house-agents on our honeymoon, our wits grew clear again, and we knew a pretty cottage when at last we saw one. It was at Brenzett, a little village set on a hill over against the southern marshes. We had gone there from the seaside village where we were staying to see the church, and 2 fields from the church we found this cottage. It stood quite by itself, about 2 miles from the village. It was a long, low building, with rooms sticking out in unexpected places. There was a bit of stonework, ivy-covered and moss-grown, just 2 old rooms, all that was left of a big house that had once stood there. And round this stonework the house had grown up. Stripped of its roses and jasmine, it would have been hideous. As it stood, it was charming, and after a brief examination we took it. It was absurdly cheap. The rest of our honeymoon we spent in grubbing about in second-hand shops in the county town, picking up bits of old oak and Chippendale chairs for our furnishing. We wound up with a run up to town and a visit to Liberty's, and soon the low, oak-beamed, lattice-windowed rooms began to be home. There was a jolly old-fashioned garden with grass paths, and no end of hollyhocks and sunflowers and big lilies. From the window you could see the marsh pastures, and beyond them the blue, thin line of the sea. We were as happy as the summer was glorious, and settled down into work sooner than we ourselves expected. I was never tired of sketching the view and the wonderful cloud effects from the open lattice, and Laura would sit at the table and write verses about them, in which I mostly played the part of foreground. We got a tall old peasant woman to do for us. Her face and figure were good, though her cooking was of the homeliest, but she understood all about gardening, and told us all the old names of the coppices and cornfields, and the stories of the smugglers and highwaymen, and better still, of the things that walked, and of the sights which met one in lonely glens on a starlit night. She was a great comfort to us, because Laura hated housekeeping as much as I loved folklore, and we soon came to leave all the domestic business to Mrs. Dorman, and to use her legends in little magazine stories, which brought in the jingling guinea. We had 3 months of married happiness, and did not have a single quarrel. One October evening I had been down to smoke a pipe with the doctor, our only neighbour, a pleasant young Irishman. Laura had stayed at home to finish a comic sketch of a village episode for the monthly Marplot. I left her laughing over her own jokes, and came in to find her a crumpled heap of pale muslin, weeping on the window-seat. "Good heavens, my darling, what's the matter?" I cried, taking her in my arms. She leant her little dark head against my shoulder, and went on crying. I had never seen her cry before. We had always been so happy, you see, and I felt sure some frightful misfortune had happened. "What is the matter? Do speak." "It's Mrs. Dorman," she sobbed. "What has she done?" I inquired, immensely relieved. "She says she must go before the end of the month, and she says her niece is ill. She's gone down to see her now. But I don't believe that's the reason, because her niece is always ill. I believe someone's been setting her against us. Her manner was so queer." "Never mind, Pussy," I said. "Whatever you do, don't cry, or I shall have to cry too, to keep you in countenance, and then you'll never respect your man again." She dried her eyes obediently on my handkerchief, and even smiled faintly. "But you see," she went on, "it really is serious, because these village people are so sheepy, and if one won't do a thing, you may be quite sure none of the others will. And I shall have to cook the dinners and wash up the hateful greasy plates, and you'll have to carry cans of water about and clean the boots and knives, and we shall never have time for work, or earn any money, or anything. We shall have to work all day, and only be able to rest when we are waiting for the kettle to boil." I represented to her that even if we had to perform these duties, the day would still present some margin for other toils and recreations, but she refused to see the matter in any but the greyest light. She was very unreasonable, my Laura, but I could not have loved her any more if she had been as reasonable as Whately. "I'll speak to Mrs. Dorman when she comes back, and see if I can't come to terms with her," I said. "Perhaps she wants a rise in her screw. It'll be all right. Let us walk up to the church." The church was a large and lonely one, and we loved to go there, especially upon bright nights. The path skirted a wood, cut through it once, and ran along the crest of the hill through 2 meadows, and round the churchyard wall, over which the old yews loomed in black masses of shadow. This path, which was partly paved, was called the Bierborg, for it had long been the way by which the corpses had been carried to burial. The churchyard was richly treed, and was shaded by great elms, which stood outside and stretched their majestic arms in benediction over the happy dead. A large low porch let one into the building by a Norman doorway and a heavy oak door studded with iron. Inside, the arches rose into darkness, and between them the reticulated windows, which stood out white in the moonlight. In the chancel the windows were of rich glass, which showed in faint light their noble colouring, and made the black oak of the choir pews hardly more solid than the shadows. But on each side of the altar lay a grey marble figure of a knight in full plate armour, lying upon a low slab, with hands held up in everlasting prayer, and these figures, oddly enough, were always to be seen if there were any glimmer of light in the church. Their names were lost, but the peasants told of them that they had been fierce and wicked men, marauders by land and sea, who had been the scourge of their time, and had been guilty of deeds so foul that the house that they had lived in, the big house, by the way, that had stood on the site of our cottage, had been stricken by lightning and the vengeance of heaven. But for all that, the gold of their heirs had bought them a place in the church. Looking at the bad, hard faces reproduced in the marble, this story was easily believed. The church looked at its best and weirdest on that night, for the shadows of the yew trees fell through the windows upon the floor of the nave, and touched the pillars with tattered shade. We sat down together without speaking, and watched the solemn beauty of the old church, with some of the awe which inspired its early builders. We walked to the chancel, and looked at the sleeping warriors. Then we rested some time on the stone seat in the porch, looking out over the stretch of quiet moonlit meadows, feeling in every fibre of our being a piece of the night and of our happy love, and came away at last with a sense that even scrubbing and blackleading were but small troubles at their worst. Mrs. Dorman had come back from the village, and I at once invited her to a tete-a-tete. "Now, Mrs. Dorman," I said, when I had got her into my painting-room, "what's all this about your not staying with us?"
"I should be glad to get away, sir, for the end of the month,"
she answered, with her usual placid dignity. "Have you any fault to find, Mrs. Dorman?"
"None at all, sir. You and your lady have always been most kind, I'm sure."
"Well, what is it? Are your wages not high enough?"
"No, sir, I gets quite enough."
"Then why not stay?"
"I'd rather not."
With some hesitation.
"My niece is ill."
"But your niece has been ill ever since we came." No answer. There was a long and awkward silence. I broke it. "Can't you stay for another month?" I asked.
"No, sir. I'm bound to go by Thursday."
And this was Monday. "Well, I must say I think you might have let us know before. There's no time now to get anyone else, and your mistress is not fit to do heavy housework. Can't you stay till next week?"
"I might be able to come back next week."
I was now convinced that all she wanted was a brief holiday, which we should have been willing enough to let her have as soon as we could get a substitute. "But why must you go this week?" I persisted. "Come, out with it." Mrs. Dorman drew the little shawl, which she always wore, tightly across her bosom, as though she were cold. Then she said, with a sort of effort,
"They say, sir, as this was a big house in Catholic times, and there was many deeds done here."
The nature of the "deeds" might be vaguely inferred from the inflection of Mrs. Dorman's voice, which was enough to make one's blood run cold. I was glad that Laura was not in the room. She was always nervous, as highly strung natures are, and I felt that these tales about our house, told by this old peasant woman with her impressive manner and contagious credulity, might have made our home less dear to my wife. "Tell me all about it, Mrs. Dorman," I said. "You needn't mind about telling me. I'm not like the young people who make fun of such things." Which was partly true.
"Well, sir,"
she sank her voice,
"you may have seen in the church, beside the altar, two shapes."
"You mean the effigies of the knights in armour?" I said cheerfully.
"I mean them two bodies, drawed up man-size in marble,"
she returned, and I had to admit that her description was 1,000 times more graphic than mine, to say nothing of a certain weird force and uncanniness about the phrase "drawed out man-size in marble."
"They do say as on All Saints' Eve them two bodies sits up on their slabs and gets off them, and then works down the aisle in their marble."
Another good phrase, Mrs. Dorman.
And as the church clock strikes 11, they walks out the church door and over the graves and along the bier vault, and if 'tis a wet night, there's the marks of their feet in the morning.
And where do they go? I asked, rather fascinated.
They comes back here to their home, sir. And if anyone meets them...
Well, what then? I asked. But no, not another word could I get from her, save that her niece was ill and she must go. After what I had heard, I scorned to discuss the niece, and tried to get from Mrs. Dorman more details of the legend. I could get nothing but warnings.
Whatever you do, sir, lock the door early on All Saints' Eve, and make the cross sign over the doorstep and on the windows.
But has anyone ever seen these things? I persisted.
That's not for me to say. I know what I know, sir.
Well, who was here last year?
No one, sir. Lady as owned the house only stopped during the summer, and she always went to London a full month afore the night. And I'm sorry to inconvenience you and your lady, but my niece is ill, and I must go on Thursday.
I could have shaken her for her absurd reiteration of that obvious fiction after she had told me her real reasons. She was determined to go, nor could our united entreaters move her in the least. I did not tell Laura the legend of the shapes that walked in their marble, partly because a legend concerning our house might perhaps trouble my wife, and partly, I think, for some more occult reason. This was not quite the same to me as any other story, and I did not want to talk about it until the day was over. I had very soon ceased to think of the legend, however. I was painting a portrait of Laura against the lattice window, and I could not think of much else. I had got a splendid background of yellow and grey sunset, and was working away with enthusiasm at her lace. On Thursday Mrs. Dorman went. She relented at parting so far as to say,
"Don't you put yourself about too much, ma'am. And if there's any little thing I can do next week, I'm sure I shan't mind."
From which I inferred that she wished to come back to us after Halloween. Up to the last she adhered to the fiction of the niece with touching fidelity. Thursday passed off pretty well. Laura showed marked ability in the matter of steak and potatoes, and I confess that my knives and the plates which I insisted upon washing were better done than I dared to expect. Friday came. It is about what happened on that Friday that this is written. I wonder if I should have believed it if anyone had told it to me. I will write the story of it as quickly and plainly as I can. Everything that happened on that day is burnt into my brain. I shall not forget anything, nor leave anything out. I got up early, I remember, and lighted the kitchen fire, and had just achieved a smoky success when my little wife came running down, as sunny and sweet as the clear October morning itself. We prepared breakfast together, and found it very good fun. The housework was soon done, and when brushes and brooms and pails were quiet again, the house was still indeed. It is wonderful what a difference one makes in a house. We really missed Mrs. Dorman, quite apart from considerations concerning pots and pans. We spent the day in dusting our books and putting them straight, and dined gaily on cold steak and coffee. Laura was, if possible, brighter and gayer and sweeter than usual, and I began to think that a little domestic toil was really good for her. We had never been so merry since we were married, and the walk we had that afternoon was, I think, the happiest time of all my life. When we had watched the deep scarlet clouds slowly pale into leaden grey against a pale green sky, and saw the white mists curl up along the hedgerows in the distant marsh, we came back to the house, silently, hand in hand. "You're sad, my darling," I said, half jestingly, as we sat down together in our little parlour. I expected a disclaimer, for my own silence had been the silence of complete happiness. To my surprise, she said, "Yes, I think I am sad, or rather I'm uneasy. I don't think I'm very well. I've shivered 3 or 4 times since we came in, and it's not cold, is it?" "No," I said, and hoped it was not a chill caught from the treacherous mists that roll up from the marshes in the dying light. No, she said she did not think so. Then, after a silence, she spoke suddenly. "Do you ever have presentiments of evil?" "No," I said, smiling, "and I shouldn't believe in them if I had." "I do," she went on.
The night my father died I knew it, though he was right away in the north of Scotland."
I did not answer in words. She sat looking at the fire for some time in silence, gently stroking my hand. At last she sprang up, came behind me, and drawing my head back, kissed me.
"There, it's over now,"
she said.
"What a baby I am! Come, light the candles, and we'll have some of these new Rubinstein duets."
And we spent a happy hour or two at the piano. At about 10:30 I began to long for the good-night pipe, but Laura looked so white that I felt it would be brutal of me to fill our sitting-room with the fumes of strong Cavendish. "I'll take my pipe outside," I said.
"Let me come too."
"No, sweetheart, not tonight. You're much too tired. I shan't be long. Get to bed, or I shall have an invalid to nurse tomorrow, as well as the boots to clean." I kissed her, and was turning to go, when she flung her arms round my neck and held me as if she would never let me go again. I stroked her hair. "Come, Pussy, you're overtired. The housework has been too much for you." She loosened her clasp a little, and drew a deep breath.
"No, we've been very happy today, Jack, haven't we? Don't stay up too long."
"I won't, my dearie." I strolled out of the front door, leaving it unlatched. What a night it was! The jagged masses of heavy dark cloud were rolling at intervals from horizon to horizon, and thin white wreaths covered the stars. Through all the rush of the cloud river the moon swam, breasting the waves and disappearing again in the darkness. When now and again her light reached the woodlands, they seemed to be slowly and noiselessly moving in time to the swing of the clouds above them. There was a strange grey light over all the earth. The fields had that shadowy bloom over them which only comes from the marriage of dew and moonshine, or frost and starlight. I walked up and down, drinking in the beauty of the quiet earth and the changing sky. The night was absolutely silent. Nothing seemed to be abroad. There was no scurrying of rabbits or twitter of the half-asleep birds. And though the clouds went sailing across the sky, the wind that drove them never came low enough to rustle the dead leaves in the woodland paths. Across the meadows I could see the church tower standing out black and grey against the sky. I walked there, thinking over our 3 months of happiness, and of my wife, her dear eyes, her loving ways. Oh, my little girl, my own little girl! What a vision came then of a long, glad life for you and me together! I heard a bell beat from the church. 11 already. I turned to go in, but the night held me. I could not go back to our little warm rooms yet. I would go up to the church. I felt vaguely that it would be good to carry my love and thankfulness to the sanctuary, whither so many loads of sorrow and gladness had been borne by the men and women of the dead years. I looked in at the low window as I went by. Laura was half lying on her chair in front of the fire. I could not see her face, only her little head showed dark against the pale blue wall. She was quite still, asleep no doubt. My heart reached out to her as I went on. There must be a God, I thought, and a God who was good. How otherwise could anything so sweet and dear as she have ever been imagined? I walked slowly along the edge of the wood. A sound broke the stillness of the night. It was a rustling in the wood. I stopped and listened. The sound stopped too. I went on, and now distinctly heard another step than mine answer mine like an echo. It was a poacher or wood-stealer most likely, for these were not unknown in our Arcadian neighbourhood. But whoever it was, he was a fool not to step more lightly. I turned into the wood, and now the footsteps seemed to come from the path I had just left. It must be an echo, I thought. The wood looked perfect in the moonlight. The large dying ferns and the brushwood showed where, through thinning foliage, the pale light came down. The tree trunks stood up like Gothic columns all around me. They reminded me of the church, and I turned into the beer balk, and passed through the corpse gate between the graves to the low porch. I paused for a moment on the stone seat where Laura and I had watched the fading landscape. Then I noticed that the door of the church was open, and I blamed myself for having left it unlatched the other night. We were the only people who ever cared to come to the church except on Sundays, and I was vexed to think that through our carelessness the damp autumn airs had had a chance of getting in and injuring the old fabric. I went in. It will seem strange, perhaps, that I should have gone halfway up the aisle before I remembered, with a sudden chill, followed by as sudden a rush of self-contempt, that this was the very day and hour when, according to tradition, the shapes drawed out man's size in marble began to walk. Having thus remembered the legend, and remembered it with a shiver, of which I was ashamed, I could not do otherwise than walk up towards the altar, just to look at the figures, as I said to myself. Really, what I wanted was to assure myself, first, that I did not believe the legend, and secondly, that it was not true. I was rather glad that I had come. I thought now I could tell Mrs. Dorman how vain her fancies were, and how peacefully the marble figures slept on through the ghastly hour. With my hands in my pockets, I passed up the aisle. In the grey dim light, the eastern end of the church looked larger than usual, and the arches above the two tombs looked larger too. The moon came out and showed me the reason. I stopped short. My heart gave a leap that nearly choked me, and then sank sickeningly. The bodies drawed out man-size were gone, and their marble slabs lay wide and bare in the vague moonlight that slanted through the east window. Were they really gone, or was I mad? Clenching my nerves, I stopped and passed my hand over the smooth slabs, and felt their flat, unbroken surface. Had someone taken the things away? Was it some vile practical joke? I would make sure anyway. In an instant I had made a torch of a newspaper which happened to be in my pocket, and lighting it, held it high above my head. Its yellow glare illumined the dark arches and those slabs. The figures were gone, and I was alone in the church. Or was I alone? And then a horror seized me, a horror indefinable and indescribable, an overwhelming certainty of supreme and accomplished calamity. I flung down the torch and tore along the aisle and out through the porch, biting my lips as I ran to keep myself from shrieking aloud. Oh, was I mad, or what was this thing that had possessed me? I leapt the churchyard wall, and took the straight cut across the fields, led by the light from our windows. Just as I got over the first stile, a dark figure seemed to spring out of the ground. Mad still with that certainty of misfortune, I made for the thing that stood in my path, shouting, "Get out of the way, can't you?" But my push was met with a more vigorous resistance than I had expected. My arms were caught just above the elbow and held as in a vice, and the raw-boned Irish doctor actually shook me. "Would ye?" he cried in his own unmistakable accents. "Would ye, then?" "Let me go, you fool!" I gasped. "The marble figures have gone from the church. I tell you, they've gone." He broke into a ringing laugh. "I'll have to give you a draught tomorrow, I see. You've been smoking too much and listening to old wives' tales." "I tell you, I've seen the bare slabs." "Well, come back with me. I'm going up Tom Palmer's daughter's cell. We're looking at the church, and let me see the bare slabs." "You go if you like," I said, a little less frantic for his laughter. "I'm going home to my wife." "Rubbish, man," said he. "Do you think I'll permit of that? Are you to go saying all your life that you've seen solid marble endowed with vitality, and me to go all my life saying that you're a coward? No, sir, you shan't do it." The night air, a human voice, and I think also the physical contact with this 6 feet of solid common sense, brought me back a little to my ordinary self, and the word coward was a mental shower bath. "Come on, then," I said sullenly. "Perhaps you're right." He still held my arm tightly. We got over the stile and walked back to the church. All was still as death. The place smelt very damp and earthy. We walked up the aisle. I am not ashamed to confess that I shut my eyes. I knew the figures would not be there. I heard Kelly strike a match. "Here they are, you see, right enough. You've been dreaming or drinking. Asking your pardon for the invitation." I opened my eyes. By Kelly's expiring vesta I saw 2 shapes lying, in their marble, on their slabs. I drew a deep breath and caught his hand. "I'm awfully indebted to you," I said. "It must have been some trick of the light, or I've been working rather hard. Perhaps that's it." Do you know, I was quite convinced they were gone. I'm aware of that, he answered, rather grimly. You'll have to be careful of that brain of yours, my friend, I assure you. He was leaning over and looking at the right-hand figure, whose stony face was the most villainous and deadly in expression. "By Jove," he said, "something's been afoot here. This hand is broken." And so it was. I was certain that it had been perfect the last time Laura and I had been there. "Perhaps someone's tried to remove them," said the young doctor. "That won't account for my impression," I objected. "Too much painting and tobacco will account for that well enough." "Come along," I said, "or my wife will be getting anxious. You'll come in and have a drop of whisky, and drink confusion to ghosts, and better sense to me." "I ought to go to Palmer's, but it's so late now I'd best leave it till morning," he replied. "I was kept late at the Union, and I've had to see a lot of people since. All right, I'll come back with ye." I think he fancied I needed him more than did Palmer's girl, so, discussing how such an illusion could have been possible, and deducing from this experience large generalities concerning ghostly apparitions, we walked up to our cottage. We saw, as we walked up the garden path, that the bright light streamed out of the front door, and presently saw that the parlour door was open too. Had she gone out? "Come in," I said, and Dr. Kelly followed me into the parlour. It was all ablaze with candles, not only the wax ones, but at least a dozen guttering, glaring tallow dips stuck in vases and ornaments in unlikely places. Light, I knew, was Laura's remedy for nervousness. Poor child, why had I left her? Brute that I was. We glanced round the room, and at first we did not see her. The window was open, and the draught set all the candles flaring one way. Her chair was empty, and her handkerchief and book lay on the floor. I turned to the window. There, in the recess of the window, I saw her. Oh, my child, my love! Had she gone to that window to watch for me? And what had come into the room behind her? To what had she turned with that look of frantic fear and horror? Oh, my little one, had she thought that it was I whose steps she heard, and turned to meet what? She had fallen back across a table in the window, and her body lay half on it and half on the window-seat, and her head hung down over the table, the brown hair loosened and fallen to the carpet. Her lips were drawn back, and her eyes wide, wide open. They saw nothing now. What had they seen last? The doctor moved towards her, but I pushed him aside and sprang to her, caught her in my arms, and cried, "It's all right, Laura. I've got you safe, wifey." She fell into my arms in a heap. I clasped her and kissed her and called her by all her pet names, but I think I knew all the time that she was dead. Her hands were tightly clenched. In one of them she held something fast. When I was quite sure that she was dead, and that nothing mattered at all any more, I let him open her hand to see what she held. It was a grey marble finger.